For more now on the murder and mutilation of 13-year-old Hamza Ali al-Khatib, I'm joined by CNN's Arwa Damon. None of our reporters can tell the story from inside Syria because it is simply too dangerous. The government refuses to allow it. Arwa is in Beirut. Arwa, what has been the response of the protesters in Syria to these reports of this heinous torture of a 13-year-old boy?
Well, Eliot, what we did hear from a prominent Syrian activist who's in Damascus, Rezan Zaytouni, she said that, first of all, she firmly believes the video that we're seeing to be authentic, and she believes that the Syrian regime deliberately released the boy's body back to his family to send a chilling message. The message being that the regime had absolutely no red lines when it came to how it was going to be handling these voices of dissent, no matter what the age, whether or not the individual in question was a child or an adult. However, if the regime's intent was to terrorize people off the streets, it appears to have caused the opposite effect. We saw numerous demonstrations across the country with people chanting their support for the 13-year-old child, vowing that Hamza's blood would not have been spilt in vain. And Eliot, we even saw children taking to the streets, despite the fact that the very same fate could be awaiting them.
On the other hand, there is also this pseudo-amnesty that Assad has issued. And what do we know about the parameters of it, what it really means, and is anybody taking that seriously?
This is not exactly an amnesty or a general pardon in the sense that many would understand it. We are not expecting to see any sort of a mass release of detainees from prison, although it is intended to apply to anyone who was detained up until today, basically up until Tuesday. According to the decree that was published on the Syrian Arab News Agency, this basically is more of a reduction in sentence. A death sentence reduced to life in prison, a life in prison sentence, depending on what the crime was, being reduced to, for example, 20 years of hard labor. And so this move is really being greeted with much skepticism, especially amongst activists who are really just viewing it as another move by the regime to try to maintain their credibility, not amongst the opposition per se, but more amongst their own loyalists.
All right, Arwa, thank you so much for that report.
Thank you.
At the State Department today, Secretary Hillary Clinton had strong words about Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. Senior State Department producer Elise Labott was there and joins me now.
Eliot, I asked Secretary Clinton about this young boy today, and she was visibly shaken when she talked about him, used his full name, Hamza al-Khatib, and here's what she had to say. Let's take a listen.
I, too, was very concerned by the reports about the young boy. In fact, I think what that symbolizes for many Syrians is the total collapse of any effort by the Syrian government to work with and listen to their own people.
So, Eliot, I asked Secretary Clinton if this action meant that the Syrian regime had really lost all legitimacy. She said that every day that goes by, the government is becoming more untenable, and she said she hopes that this young boy will not die in vain. She hopes the government will end the brutality and move towards democracy. Really the strongest comments I've heard from anybody in this administration about the future of this regime.
You know, Elise, there obviously is the frustration. I think it is impossible for anybody who has seen the video, seen the pictures of what is almost a medieval act of torture not to respond that way. But I guess the question for the State Department is what will happen next with respect to U.S. policy? Is there a tangible, definitive next step that the Secretary indicated will follow because of this heinous behavior?
Well, the next step is to go to the UN Security Council, and the U.S. is really pushing for a strong condemnation of the Syrian regime. But the question is, what is that going to do? It's not calling for any sanctions. They're having a lot of problems with the Russians and the Chinese even signing up for this condemnation. So it's really not clear what leverage, what influence the U.S. has in terms of cracking down on the regime and getting it to end the brutality of its people, Eliot.
All right. Thank you, Elise. All right, we turn now to one of the wisest minds in the Arab world. Fuad Ajami is the director of Middle Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And full disclosure, he was my professor 30 years ago. Back my freshman year at Princeton, Professor Ajami, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Your wisdom was evident even back then.
Thank you very much.
This is mortifying, factually. The question I have for you is, will this fundamentally change the internal dynamics within Syria?
I don't think so, Eliot. I think this regime is a very strange beast. It's a very strange regime. It rests on a minority community, the Alawis of Syria. They are mountain people. They've come down to the city. They've joined the army. They are the intelligence barons of the regime. They are Bashar al-Assad's community, and they are committed to him. There will not be defections. There will not be a crack in the regime the way that we have witnessed in Libya. This is a very strange regime. It's a regime at war with its population. And the Alawis, 10 to 11% of the population, have managed to capture state power. They will fight to keep this regime.
Now, Bashar Assad, the son, for a few years, had managed to fool the West, apparently, and we believe that somehow he was a voice of reform. Does this rip that mask off and finally make it clear that he is no such thing?
Well, absolutely. But remember, I mean, this story has a trail. The trail is that in the year 2000, when Hafiz Assad died, and he installed his son. I mean, imagine a country being handed over from father to son. He installed his second son because his first son, who was supposed to be heir, died in a car accident. So he brought this ophthalmologist from London who loved the music of Phil Collins, who faked, if you will, that he is at one with the modern world, and he designated him as his successor. 11 years later, we can see the myth of Bashar al-Assad as a reformer. He's as cruel and may even be more cold-blooded than his late father.
And when you compare him to Gaddafi, and this game of comparisons perhaps is meaningless, other than the fact that to the extent you are seeking some sort of symmetry or some sort of consistency in U.S. policy, Gaddafi to Assad, they begin to look very similar these days.
Well, they look very similar, but let's remember one thing about Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian regime. When you take a look at Syria, it's centrally located, and even though it's a poorer country than Libya, it has no oil. Nevertheless, it has convinced the rest of the world that Syria is a major player. Take a look at the Arabs. The Arabs broke with Gaddafi. They think he's a brigand. He calls himself the king of the kings of Africa. He turned his back on them. But the Arabs are very, very committed to the Syrian regime. This is a much more centrally placed regime in the game of nations than is the Gaddafi regime.
Well, that goes right to my next question. We, the United States, we were hesitant to move even with respect to Gaddafi in Libya until we had the facade or the imprimatur of the Arab nations themselves saying, yes, we want to unseat Gaddafi. Will there be that sort of unity, or will there be any uniform purpose among Arab leaders turning on Assad? And I hear you saying no.
You will bring me back, I hope. And there is no chance that the Arab states will single out the Syrian regime and say this is a brutal regime. They don't like Bashar. They don't trust Bashar al-Assad. They favored his old father because he was a more wily player, but they will not break with Bashar the way they broke with Muammar al-Gaddafi.
Well, in that case, can the United States and should the United States act in unison with NATO nations, perhaps, without the imprimatur, the support of Arab leaders who must look at the brutality of Assad and say he is on a par with Gaddafi?
To be honest with you, I don't see American policy going in that direction. Go back to May 19 when the famous speech that President Obama gave at the State Department about the Arab Spring, but also about the Israeli-Palestinian
Famous or infamous, but we'll come back to that.
Exactly. But when you go back to that speech, he basically said, we had a mandate in Libya. We don't have a mandate in Syria. He drew a line about where American power could be used and where American power can't be used. And let's remember that even on Libya, President Obama's half in, not fully in, let alone on Syria.
Well, look, the Libyan debacle, the quagmire stalemate, obviously is problematic in and of itself. Sure. But the question of looking for consistency, when you read the speech he gave on May 19, when you read the speech he gave when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, in terms of the legitimacy of force, one would think applying those standards to Assad and Syria, it is a perfect example of legitimate use of force to unseat a leader who, as you say, is at war with his own population.
Well, the right to protect is one of the great issues in our world, but President Obama is very, very timid, if you will. I mean, that's one word, but very, very careful about the use of American power. We haven't even recalled our ambassador from Damascus, and we keep saying, even President Obama said Bashar has a choice. He can either lead the process of reform or get out of the way. And imagine in the bunker, in the world where Bashar al-Assad lives with his brother and his brother-in-law and his gang and the intelligence barons around him. This is just idle talk.
Well, there have been so many false starts. There have been so many, the big speech that Assad pretended to give 2 or 3 weeks ago in which he was going to lay out reform, of course, amounted to nothing. The amnesty that is so-called amnesty, it's hard to figure out what it is that meaningful at all? To whom is he appealing in doing this?
Eliot, part of the whole cult of totalitarian regime is that the ruler can both grant life and he can also kill. So this is Bashar al-Assad showing the Syrian people, I, master of your universe. Remember, there were only 6 million Syrians when Hafiz Assad, the father, was president. Now there are 22 million Syrians. 16 million people have known no other president than Hafiz Assad and his son Bashar. So the message is, we have the power to grant pardon, and we have the power to kill children.
And the capacity to use that power seems unabated, unlimited by any sense of moral dictate. The children, though, the images of children marching in the street, and of course we have no idea how widespread that might be. Does that crystallize? In other nations, you had Tahrir Square, you had, even in Tunisia, you had some popular uprising that seemed to crystallize. Does that happen in Assad, or fear is still the dominant emotion?
I think the young people are not afraid, and this is what's mystifying Bashar al-Assad. Look, I kill people. Why aren't you afraid of me as your elders were afraid of my father? I think the barrier of fear has been broken, and you have a standoff between a regime that cannot be overthrown yet, and a population that can't be sent back to their homes and back to the fear.
So does this stalemate of brutality continue, and do the bodies pile up and the images of children being mutilated continue to pour forth with no resolution?
I think I wish there was another verdict one can issue. I mean, look, this man has rounded up tens of, there at least, you hear 10,000 people have been rounded up as prisoners. 1,000 people or more have been killed. People are fleeing to Jordan, they're fleeing to Lebanon, and yet the regime does not blink, and yet the regime does not crack.
Well, then let's come back to the lesson to be taken from where the United States has intervened and where not. We see Mubarak having been pushed out, the putative ally. We see Gaddafi standing up to our force, and as you say, a muted American response, letting the French take the lead. And we see no response of any magnitude in Syria. So what does the leadership in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain take from this in terms of understanding the use of U.S. power?
Well, I'm afraid there may be a terrible lesson, which is that people who are vulnerable to our judgment, such as the ruler in Tunisia and the ruler in Egypt, are easier to overthrow than people who are not vulnerable to our judgment, such as Gaddafi and such as the ruler in Syria. So I think there are things in the world that don't really lend themselves to American power. We have to admit that, and we have to face that. And this Syrian debacle, the Syrian massacre, the Syrian slaughter, the standoff between a killer regime and its population is evidence of that.
So if you were to receive a phone call from the president and he said, Professor Ajami, tell me, what do we do with Syria? Would you say this is a situation where we simply can't determine the outcome? Or would you say, Mr. President, damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead, we must stand up for the lessons that you were trying to teach in Libya and intervene for the cause of morality?
Well, if that was President Bush, he would call me. President Obama is not going to call me. I'm not standing
Accept my premise for a moment. If you got the call, what would you say?
I really honestly don't know what the issue is. I think we have to separate ourselves from this regime. We have to shed the illusion that this regime is going to reform, and we have to take away from the regime one argument, which is the regime always frightens us by saying, we're a secular dictatorship, the alternative to us is the Muslim Brotherhood. We have to say we are willing to face the alternative. It takes that courageous first step. They are willing to face the alternative.
We need to be willing to sacrifice some degree of uncertainty and risk.
Absolutely.
And understand that is what the world will look like. Otherwise, we have tyrants and villains as our allies.
That's about it.
All right, Professor Ajami, as always, thank you so much. And yes, we'll have you back whenever you can. Thank you, sir. Coming up, Jeffrey Toobin is here to talk politics. Jeff, you're